Okay, hello everyone, welcome. I think we'll get started. Welcome to the panel LGBT Rescue Narratives. I'm Gayatri, Gopinath at NYU. And I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel. Unfortunately, two people are not with us, Dana Olwan and Sarah Brack. But this gives us a little bit more time for our four panelists. So I'm actually going to introduce them in the order that they're going to speak and then turn it over to them. So our first speaker is Katherin Fobear. Katherin is a PhD candidate at the Liu Institute for Global Issues and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at British Columbia. Her work focuses on oral histories and memory artwork of sexual and gender minority refugees living in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our second speaker is Colleen Jankovic. Is that right? Okay. Colleen holds a PhD in critical and cultural studies, film studies, and women's studies from the University of Pittsburgh. She researches an ongoing history of cinema's enlistment in the colonization and occupation of Palestine, using methodologies from queer and trans studies, visual culture studies, and information science. She's the grant writer for Al-Kaus for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society. Our next speaker is Emrah Yildiz. Emrah is a joint PhD candidate in social anthropology and Middle Eastern studies at Harvard University. He holds a BA in cultural anthropology and German studies and an MA in cultural anthropology from Wesleyan University. His current research interests include historiography and ethnography of borderlands, political economy and contraband commerce, anthropology of Islam and pilgrimage, as well as studies of gender and sexuality in the Middle East. And our final speaker is Fatime Jaffer. Fatime is a PhD student at the Interdisciplinary Grad Studies program at the University of British Columbia, where she studies alternative media and social movements, and works as the editor of Cutting Edge, a student-run, peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journal. A longtime activist and alternative journalist, she now writes guest columns for the local queer paper Extra West, and she's also a member of Asylum Vancouver, the Canadian Muslim LGBTQ organization, as well as a facilitator of Tricone Vancouver, a South Asian LGBTQ group. So let's turn it over to Katherin, whose paper is entitled Queer Settlers, Exploring the Intersections of Colonial Violence and Settler Homonationalism with LGBTQ Refugees in Canada.
Thank you so much. So this is actually a working paper that I'm still kind of chewing on through the year. And before I go into the points of race, the paper will focus a lot, particularly on the refugee hearing process. That's when the person goes to the IRB, where they then get determined if they get refugee status or not. And before I go into the points I raise, I do want to say that while I am focusing on the system of the refugee system within Canada, I do not want to make sexual and gender minority refugees appear in this critique and this sort of commentary that I'm making as agentless or voiceless in my critique. I think it's really important that, to acknowledge that sexual and gender minority refugees, these are people who claim refugee status based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, show incredible strength, tenacity, agency in leaving their country of origin, finding their way to Canada, or making a refugee claim outside of Canada, and going through a very difficult and problematic system. So I think that's important to state before I go into the critiques and the sort of thing that I'm sort of working out right now in this paper. For everyone who's maybe not familiar with Canada's refugee system or sort of Canada's history, especially as it relates to sexual and gender minorities, Canada does have a long history especially with sexual and gender minority refugees. In 1991, Canada was the first Western nation to grant refugee status on the basis of sexual orientation. In 1993, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that sexual orientation be included in the parameters of the 1951 UN Convention for a particular social group. So basically saying that you can claim refugee status because you're a member of this particular social group, being a sexual and gender minority. And also that by 1995, Canada's Refugee Tribunal was the first to have educators being trained and in-house human rights information being learned in this process on particular needs of sexual and gender minorities. So I'm not here to completely demonize Canada's refugee system in the sense that I think there are some really good things about it. But I'm here to argue that there's significant room for critique and inquiry into the refugee process itself. Heteronormativity and cultural bias within the refugee decision-making process continues to, in my opinion, to victimize, marginalize, and ultimately, a lot of times, penalize sexual and gender minority applicants from gaining refugee status in Canada. And this problem speaks to what I see as a general oversight on research, especially on forced migration studies, refugee studies also it's called, is that research, that there's a lack of critical inquiry into the historical and ongoing processes of settler colonialism, especially in a settler state like Canada. And how also, and this then gets related to how refugees are also depicted within the literature, but then also outside in the Canadian media, and the use of, in my case, the use of the sexual and gender minority refugees' experiences by the Canadian state, and also I see by mainstream, predominantly white LGBTQ rights groups, to fuel what I see is oftentimes very xenophobic and very much incorporated to settler nationalism within their dialogue. Ethnographic research on refugee and forced migration emphasizes the importance of viewing the diversity of today's refugees. Too often, this research has focused primarily on refugees' countries of origin, so we're kind of looking at them where they came from, and then we don't really focus on where they come to, and I think that's a huge, significant oversight. Yeah, because, or to put it another way, we must not only, ask where refugees have come from, but where they have come to. And this has particular significance in settler states like Canada, in which research on refugee and forced migration largely ignores the history of ongoing colonialism that has made settlement possible through the control and inflicting violence on groups defined by race, gender, race, class, ability, and sexuality. So one of the things that I've been working on this paper and sort of in my research as well is just a question of what does it mean to file a refugee claim in a state like Canada in which there's ongoing colonial violence? What does it mean to get refuge in a settler state? What are the implications? How do refugees engage in settlement in an internally colonized state? And what, just the whole sort of significance of this. I think these questions need to be interrogated further, and I don't have the answers. These are just more, as always, I never have the answers, I just have the questions. Shireen Razak says, that migration and settlement cannot be adequately theorized outside of spatial relations of imperial and colonial power. Canada's national identity and its regulation of immigration is informed through ongoing settler colonialism, in which the erasure of Indigenous persons and the policing of predominantly non-white, non-Western immigrants go hand in hand with the creation of the Canadian state and solidifying its borders. Therefore, histories and theories of colonization and imperialism are critical in studies of looking at migration within Canada, especially refugee migration. Investigating refugee settlement in a settler state involves looking at what I see is also at whiteness and national mythologies of settlement in Canada. This involves not only recognizing difference in the histories and experiences of migration, but also the different historical and contextual networks that draw people into collectives and create what Adam says, microcircuits of power, locating some in positions of influence and privilege and marginalizing others. Now getting on back to sexual and gender minority refugees. Until very recently, sexual and gender minority refugees and migrants in general were very much ignored by the dominant sort of migration literature, especially forced migration literature. Much of the literature on refugee and forced migration continues to render sexuality invisible by having heterosexuality as the unmarked but taken for granted premise for migratory relationships, desires, and processes. But what has been written on sexual and gender minorities, while small, is very significant. Particularly Sherilyn Jordan writes, especially in the Canadian system, that undertaking asylum application within Canada for sexual and gender minority refugees entails accessing and working within a refugee system that was not designed with sexual and gender minorities in mind. There are many types of reasons for filing a refugee claim, whether it's in-state or out-of-state, political, cultural, ethnic, religious, or in the case of being a particular social group, sexual and gender minorities. And everyone who makes a refugee claim goes under the same process. It's the same sort of process for everyone, regardless of your claim. So as you can imagine, without going too much detail into the refugee sort of claiming process and determination process, the one-size-fits-all model does not work. And especially for individuals fleeing from persecution based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. Unlike other particular social groups based on political or ethnic persecution or being a member of a particular group, the burden of proof of persecution for sexual and gender minorities, which is important, in order to make a refugee claim, you have to prove that you are being persecuted. And that's a really strong word within the literature and within the system itself, is that it relies, to prove that you've been persecuted, relies entirely on your testimony, more so than I think other groups, where they might have a little bit of outside documentation of the violence that's being inflicted onto them. Because of sexual and gender minorities, sometimes it's often a very private or very hidden persecution. It relies almost on their testimonies to the judge saying why they're persecuted, why they can't go back, and therefore why they should have refugee status. This requires then sexual and gender minority claimants to explicitly doc sometimes very heavily stigmatized identities and to disclose traumatic events and experiences that are deeply private. Sexual and gender identities also a lot of times seen by the Canadian refugee process as being more voluntary in that than other identity categories, which makes it appear as a disability that could be easily avoided. Like if you act straight, you'll be fine. If you move to a city instead of the countryside, you'll be fine. You don't need a refugee status here. But what also that's going into it is not only sort of the heteronormativity within the refugee process, but what I see also as a incredible whiteness and cultural bias within the refugee system, especially thinking about what constitutes sexual orientation and gender identity and the persecution and everything that wraps up and around it. And what I call is, what I'm saying, Western constructions, but you could also say Canadian, white predominantly Canadian constructions of sexual identity. The division between your public and private are often put upon claimants that may not necessarily identify or fit within the role of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, the ideas that we put into it. Sexual and gender minority refugee claimants must prove their authenticity as being a member of this particular LGBTQ group. And they have to work against and work with Western narratives of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex identities and coming out for recognition of their membership to this particular social group. And what happens is that a lot of times these claimants then must prove their authenticity of their sexual identity by reverse covering, emphasizing some traits over others, based on Western stereotypes of sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation. Often these stereotypes are very intricately linked with race, in which the criteria used to ascertain whether or not the applicant's identity and behavior meets the sort of requirements are very much based on what I see as racialized stereotypes and a whiteness of gay norms. The gay norm that serves what I see, what I'm calling the gay norm, but what I would also call whiteness or white sort of sexuality, is that it serves as the basis for legitimate, authentic gay identity is based on the politics of the fact that queerness is whiteness, in that it is only the privileged, non-racialized sexual minority that can place their sexuality as exceptional and as a primary marker of their identity. Sexual exceptionalism works by first glossing over boundaries of gender, race, and class formations, and then implicitly privileging these sort of what I would call white Western gay norms. Therefore, as many refugee claimants come from very diverse cultural backgrounds and many are disproportionately low income, the effort to prove to the Refugee Hearing Board that you are a sexual and gender minority becomes heavily racialized and classed. Putting sexual and gender minority refugee claimants into this sort of racialized class sexual identity categories creates confusion in the inconsistent rulings in the Canadian Immigration Refugee Board, as refugees are left under the scrutiny of culturally insensitive and racially biased conceptions of sexuality and gender identity. And there's a lot of evidence within the research that has shown that have all given evidence of the IRB, the Immigration Refugee Board, rejecting a person's claim because they looked straight enough, or they didn't know what a rainbow flag was, or they didn't go to a gay bar, or they didn't march in the parade. Like all of these very particularly cultural constructions of sexuality being really much put onto these claimants that may not necessarily identify with them and should not have to be sort of put into that category anyways, or put into that sort of very racialized class categories. Because of time, I'm just going to gloss over this last little part, but this is the other part of the paper, which was about homonationalism, which is why I'm at this conference, but that's how it goes. A second danger that I also see, especially with sexual and gender minority refugee claimants, is that many a times within the media, but also I think within the activism that I'm seeing as an activist within the refugee society, and then also as an LGBT activist myself, is that there's an appropriation of sexual and gender minority refugees' experiences to serve what I see as oftentimes very nationalistic and very nationalistic and very also Canadian identity foreign policies that not only silence the voices and complex experiences of sexual and gender minority refugees, but ignores how sexualities are used for imperialistic, militaristic, and nationalistic aims. What I see is that there's a lot of what I've seen within just being an activist and being involved in this research is that there's a lot of let's help these poor, the sort of the rescue narrative, right? Of let's help these poor to come into the great state of Canada. Canada is welcoming and opening, but yet, as anybody who lives in Canada can talk to it, especially about the racialization, as well, the racism, and the homophobia that is still very much present within Canada. And I think what happens is that, taking this sort of the rescue narrative of us gays are helping the gays outside and we're going to bring them into this great state of Canada, and I'm paraphrasing a lot when I'm saying this, is that it not only silences the complexity of sexual and gender minority refugees' experience, obviously, but also ignores how Canada and the global north have been implicated in the violence worldwide towards sexual and gender minorities through economic, social, and political inequality. And oftentimes, what I see in these narratives is that culture is substituted for imperialism, as stereotypical and orientalizing images and metaphors are used to separate the racism, sexism, and homophobia in the global south from the progressive, developed, multiculturalism accepted Canada. And, as Shireen Razak says about rescue narratives, especially for refugees, that when claimants have to come to the board and talk about, how they're being persecuted, and they have to be kind of forced into these very narrow definitions of what a sexual minority is, as well as what is persecution. The Canadian Immigration Refugee Board never has to ask them in this process, how the first world, or they themselves, the Canadian state, has contributed to the crisis that has led to massive social and political upheavals that in turn produces refugees, and in turn produces sexual and gender minority refugees. They don't have to focus on first responsibility and accountability, and thus can proceed to demand that those they help be deserving of it in terms that they define. The stage is set for the deserving victims and the benevolent helpers. And I think I'll just conclude here just saying that, for me, as a scholar into this, and I'm still working through this paper, but we need to look at how the wider unequal global relations inform and regulate migration and cellular migration as well. But then also look at how whiteness and also our constructions of identity, persecution, and categories shape the refugee process as well as the experiences that sexual and gender minorities refugee claimants face when they're here making a refugee claim. And yeah, so I'll just conclude from there, but yeah, so thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Colleen Jankovic, and her paper is entitled Paranoia, the Untold Story of Queer Palestine and Non-Aligned Queer Solidarity.
I'll have to begin with an apology.
Okay.
Actually, I want to begin by thanking you all for being here, everyone for coming out, also to Sarah Schulman and all the organizers and volunteers who are here today to make this happen. This is an incredibly exciting conference to be at. So the title change reflects the kind of narrower scope that I ended up giving the paper, and also a kind of shift in focus that even just happened over the last few days in light of conversations that I had with activists and other people who were here for this conference. So if you can. And I've also kind of divided this into parts, and we'll see if I get to all the parts. So part one, Invisible Men and the Untold Story. In an early scene of the Israeli documentary Invisible Men, Shaul Gonen of the then-named Israeli Society for the Protection of Personal Rights, now Agudah, and Luai, a gay Palestinian asylum seeker, sit together at a desk. Shaul is helping Luai write the story that will lead to the approval of his application for asylum in a European country, unnamed in the film, since Israel will not allow him to seek asylum there. So it's really great to have Katherin's talk about the refugee status process in Canada, because you'll see how this kind of fits a lot of those tropes and those practices. A narrator tells us, in order to apply for asylum abroad, Luai was asked to write down his story. The clip actually wasn't working in the PowerPoint, so I have it.
לחשוב לפי דברים שאתה חושב שרצו במקרה שלך. הרבה זמן, יש לנו הרבה זמן. כשהייתי בגיל 8, הייתי הולך לבית ספר. והיה לי בחינות בגיל שלי. הלכנו לבית ספר. כשאנחנו חוזרים מהבית ספר, שמים בית ספר, הולכים הביתה, והיה משחק איתי, כאילו אנחנו חברים. ולאט לאט, כאילו, יש לו בנדון יותר גדול. פעם אחת התחיל לדף אותי.
Luai tells his story slowly as Shaul writes it down in Hebrew. Luai also appears to be writing the scene. A slow zoom takes us into a close-up on Luai's face, and then a close-up on Shaul's handwriting. The scene ends with Luai stating, "I've never told this story before." A statement that's difficult to parse given that this story is necessary for his successful asylum application. Did Shaul in the Refugee Rights Clinic not know his story before agreeing to assist him? Is this statement part of his asylum story, so does it include it in this written document? Or is Luai simply telling Shaul that this is a kind of punctuation at the end of his story? Or is this a statement for the documentary film audience? Is Luai narrating his story out loud so Shaul can write it out for him? Or was this by request of the filmmakers, a sort of added statement? Although nothing in the film cues us to ask critical questions about the mediation and even coercion of Luai's asylum narrative, this scene's odd combination of translation and confession is hard to ignore. The film as a whole is structured around 3 Palestinians and their stories. This is the language from the film's description itself. And So 3 Palestinians and their stories told in a confessional style to show or directly to the camera. I first read about Invisible Men, directed by Yariv Motzer, from its Indiegogo fundraising page. So it was ultimately backrolled by several Dutch and Israeli funders, including the New Israel Fund. The film claimed to tell the, quote, untold side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, unquote, gay men escaping from what the director calls the ghettos of the West Bank for Israel's most liberal city, Tel Aviv. I imagine their stories might be gratifying to those who have read the few AP stories or pro-Israel lobby pamphlets that claim, with little or no evidence, that these stories happen in Palestinian society all the time. In fact, Shaul Gonen is the primary source of the most often stories, so our kind of protagonist in the film. For instance, a BBC story from 2003 titled Death Threat to Palestinian Gays, and a Reuters story, Palestinian Gay Runaways Survive on Israeli Streets. So these are stories that are often cited in kind of Stand With Us, pro-Israel lobby pamphlets about this. Jason Ritchie is a scholar. His dissertation actually critiques specifically Shaul Gonen's kind of role in this, and him kind of serving as an expert on queer Palestinians and as well as other queer Israeli activists, sort of expert Orientalist knowledge on queer Palestinian experience. While Invisible Men claims to tell the untold story, it does not question, it doesn't question these modes of confession that produce the narratives asylum seekers must tell in order to successfully receive this kind of legal recognition. Furthermore, as a rather conventionally structured documentary, the film's style reinforces the logic of the untold story by underemphasizing the construction and production of the confessional narratives as well as the film's larger narrative. Part 2, the bubble and thin critique. An Israeli soldier approaches the camera and announces, "This is a restricted area, you can't film here," momentarily placing his hand on the lens and obscuring the visual frame. The soldier speaks directly to us, to the viewer, since our vision in this opening shot aligns with the point of view of 3 activists or reporters, we're not quite sure, who are determined to film at the checkpoint. White lines that appear in the corners of the frame, they're actually difficult to see here, clearly mark the videographer's perspective and distinguish it from the otherwise unmarked style or kind of film analysis language, the continuity editing style of the primary world of, as a lot of you probably know, The Bubble. Written and directed by a gay Israeli couple, Eitan Fox and Gal Lukovsky, The Bubble tells a doomed gay romance story between Ashkenazi Jewish Israeli Noam and West Bank Palestinian Ashraf, a love affair that infamously ends in Ashraf blowing up both men in a final scene. It is impossible for Ashraf to be gay in Palestine in the narrative, and the film allows him the opportunity for a liberated gay identity in Tel Aviv for a short while. Smuggled in through a very thin layer of political critique of contemporary Israeli society, state, and military are familiar invocations of racialized Palestinian cultural backwardness and rigidity, neoliberal gay identity politics undergirded by particular tropes of representation and visibility, and a reiteration of a cycle of violence approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This cycle of violence frame is especially apparent after Ashraf's completely apolitical martyr operation, so the film positions it as apolitical. Noam and Ashraf dissolve into bright white in their near-kiss explosion, and afterwards a television report brings us the news coverage of the bombing, implying that only we know, the audience, the real story behind what others would only recognize as yet another suicide bombing on a cafe in Tel Aviv. The film's narrative, so this is the television news report. This is one of the kind of victims who we know from the film already of the bombing. The film's narrative world has died as the camera floats up into the clouds. So after we see the kind of white lines on the frame indicating that we're seeing through the news footage, we get this image where we can see, it's difficult to see the 2 bodies that are covered, the exploded cafe behind. We see a film crew there, another television camera is in the foreground. And from here, we get kind of a tracking shot away up into that dissolves into the clouds. So it's as if the narrative world has kind of died. It's floating up into the heavens. So the film's narrative world has died. Only Noam's voice returns to narrate a political fantasy of coexistence through an imagined shared childhood memory between him and Ashraf. Scenes involving television news and activist video documentation reappear several times throughout the film, especially at the checkpoint, suggesting that representation and visibility are somehow important to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The reappearance of visual news and activist media do not, however, prompt a reflection on the film's own mediation. For instance, returning to the opening scene, after the initial point of view subjective camera shot that the film opens with, the next shot locates us behind the checkpoint activists or reporters, one shouldering a large video camera, and noticeably unmediated. So again, the white lines have disappeared. It is from this location that we are first introduced to the film's protagonist, Noam, who in the next shot appears through the activist camera point of view to offer less forceful prohibition on filming than the opening line from the other soldier, and then I don't care. Noam's ambivalence about his idea of his Israeli Defense Force service, reserve service at the checkpoint is only marginally attributed to a kind of progressive left or left political stance in the film, and serves in this opening scene more to establish his characterization throughout as a sensitive, indie, alternative type of guy, recognizable to a European and North American audience through, for instance, the T-shirts he wears throughout the films. Rolling Stones, Morrissey, Monkees, he just keeps wearing these different shirts. Noam walks away from the checkpoint activists, and the next sequence of shots answer the implied question, why are the activists filming at the checkpoint and why are they not allowed to film, since this is how the film begins. Palestinian travelers through the checkpoint on a bus are lined up and directed to lift their shirts one by one. The camera lingers on Palestinian Ashraf as he lifts his shirt, and a quick shot reverse shot between close-ups of Ashraf's and Noam's face transforms the laid-bare everyday violence and humiliation of Israeli checkpoint security practices into a constrained site of queer desired production. But the bubble is decidedly not offering a queer frame for commenting on the violence of checkpoint practices of identification, detention, and surveillance. Rather, these opening scenes establish the film's narrative world by leaving behind the activist documentary mode of filming, and when the narrative dies, we are left again with documentary footage. Through various engagements with cinematic mediation, so sites of filming, representational politics, and political fantasy, I argue that the bubble produces a deceptive, thin critique of Israeli occupation that is important to locate in this commentary on narrative versus documentary form. I argue that while the film invites us to critique news and activist filming for their role in politics of occupation and conflict, it doesn't invite us to question cinema's political potential in narrative mode, so in the bubble's mode. The bubble's Untold story is marked as one we can access only through the narrative cinematic world via its particular and special modes of cinematic identification. So while I absolutely agree with other critics that the bubble, with its various Israeli Film Fund and Foreign Ministry investments in its production, exhibition, and distribution, it is a clear example of Brand Israel's pinkwashing campaign, it would be hard to deny and too easy to expose the film's appeal to a kind of liberal affect. Through an appeal to seemingly undeniable reference points of progress and tolerance, the film's thin critique smuggles in and reinforces, among other things, the untold story of homophobic Palestinian society as the root of the queer Palestinians' problems. Part 3, to give some context on pinkwashing. In pinkwashing, I'll just give you some of this. Invisible Men won the Outstanding Documentary Award at Frameline 36, San Francisco International LGBT Film Festival, among several other awards, and it is played at a number of North American and European LGBT, queer, Jewish, human rights, and documentary film festivals. One of the sponsors of the U.S. tour is a wider bridge dedicated to, quote, building LGBT bridges with Israel, which partners with a long list of organizations that are key players in Brand Israel pinkwashing, or that we recognize as such. The Israeli embassy provided funding to a number of festivals that screened Invisible Men, and consequently Palestine solidarity activists in several cities organized to picket and boycott the film. Activists stand firm on their respect for the Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, including the academic and cultural boycott, by protesting films such as Invisible Men. Under these circumstances, the fundamental demands of boycott, divestment, and sanctions are worth repeating here, since you might not know them, and maybe they haven't been noted. They are 1, the end of occupation and dismantling of the separation barrier. These are kind of fundamental demands. 2, the right of return for displaced Palestinians. And 3, the recognition and restoration of equal rights of citizenship for Palestinians, people of Palestinian descent with Israeli citizenship. As Jason Tompkins describes, writing about the boycott of Invisible Men in particular, quote, cultural boycotts have never been cynical, divisive demands for censorship, as they are often accused, but principled, nonviolent, critical, and circumstantial tactics of education and resistance. Vancouver's Crews Against Israeli Apartheid called for a boycott of the film. Activists in Chicago picketed the film's inclusion in the Chicago International Social Change Festival, considering the film to be, quote, racist, inconsistent, and contrary to the very idea of social justice on which the festival is founded. The action resulted in the festival director actually dropping the film from the festival. In San Francisco, Palestine Solidarity activists interrupted a screening of Invisible Men to protest San Francisco LGBT International Film Festival's relationship with the Israeli government and the Israeli consulate funding of a visit by the film's director. As Kate Raphael reported in Mondoweiss, an activist asked Mozart, the director, to respond to the call for Frameline to end its relationship with the consulate. Mozart stated, "I disagree with it. I am sponsored by the Israeli government. I could not make films without the Israeli government," adding, "What's happening with Israel is Israelis is that they live in a society which is somehow more liberal and democratic than what is happening in the West Bank and Gaza. These regimes that are controlling the West Bank and Gaza are very primitive." Mozart also disagreed with the accusation of pinkwashing, stating, "I'm criticizing the occupation, the Israeli army, the officials, everyone." Writer and producer Adam Rosner added, "The film does a tremendous job of avoiding accusations of pinkwashing, citing its supposed balance." So, and you can ask me later for the context around the bubble and the protest and boycott response to that. I offer the pinkwashing and anti-pinkwashing context around these films in part to draw attention to the fact that these films and other new films are still screening at festivals, especially in North America. Out in the Dark, a replay of many of the plot points of The Bubble, is just now appearing at LGBT, queer, Jewish, documentary film festivals, etc. This urgency should encourage us to get involved in info pickets and boycotts where appropriate and possible. But I didn't come here again to only enumerate more Israeli pinkwashing offenders or examples of Israeli pinkwashing in cinema. I wanted to bring something of something that I know from kind of film and media critique, to offer something that might be useful for thinking about broader politics of representation and in film and political critique, as well as some cautionary thoughts useful for visual media production with the aim of providing counter-images to Israeli pinkwashing in particular. By locating Invisible Men in The Bubble and their discourses of the untold story and this pernicious strategy that I refer to as thin critique today, I hope to locate their more subtle stylistic and formal characteristics that can make it difficult to dislodge the film from liberal political resistance to conscientious adherence to the Palestinian call for academic and cultural boycott. In other words, I hope to offer some useful ways to respond to the film besides pointing to its Israeli embassy funding and its more obvious investments in pinkwashing discourse, which is also important. The fourth part of the paper, which I don't think I can get to, was to provide a counterexample, because I think that's kind of important to do in this sort of context, which would be Sharif Wekhead's chic point, Fashion for Israeli Checkpoints, in part because it uses both documentary modes and a more kind of experimental fiction mode of having these attractive male models walk a catwalk in checkpoint-ready attire, and then actual documentary footage of searches at checkpoints and in other locations, so that these modes kind of speak back to each other in the film. They're not actually shown, I don't think, at any point next to each other, but they are kind of put in conversation with each other. So that's a counterpoint, I think, inviting us to think sort of critically about both of those modes in this case. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colleen. Our next speaker is Emrah Yildiz. Is it the same title? Okay, so the title of Emrah's paper is Alignments of International Refugee Law, Liberalism, and Sexuality on the Road, Iranian Asylum Seekers Through the UN High Commission for Refugees in Turkey.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Sarah Schulman and everyone who's here. I'm very excited to be a part of this conference. So I'll start with a quatrain from Emrah Khayyam, first in Persian, and then I'll provide you with the English translation. از منزل کفر تا به دین یک نفس است و از عالم شک تا به یقین یک نفس است. این یک نفس عزیز رو خوش می‌دار که از حاصل عمر ما همین یک نفس است. From the station of disbelief to that of faith is but a breath. and but one breath from the world of doubt to that of faith. This precious breath let us pass gaily, since the harvest of our lives is but that very breath. One breath that was allowed to pass, but not as gaily as they aspired to inhale or exhale as a male-male couple in Tehran, led Karim and Sahan to Kayseri, Turkey 3 years ago. In Kayseri, locked to their location without a right to resettle or work, and susceptible to random security searches and an obscene soil tax charged to every refugee in Turkish territory, Karim and Sahan had waited for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to evaluate their files for asylum for 2 years. When we met for the second time in Kayseri in the summer of 2010, their breaths did not carry traces of saffron and cardamom as they used to in their 2-bedroom apartment in upscale northern Tehran, but rather those of mismal dampness of the decrepit shelter and nauseous smoke of their coal-operated heater in provincial Kayseri. Unable to find another apartment to rent due to the local landlord's rejection to host perverts and moral deviants, they had just moved in with 4 other Iranian asylum seekers into a barely standing house at the city outskirts, locally labeled as the House of Satan. Karim and Sahan, like many before them, had accessed the state-blocked website of a Toronto-based NGO named the Iranian Queer Railroad. Having heard about the organization in gay chat rooms of Yahoo and in queer networking sites such as Manjam, Karim and Sahan signed on to the journey that IRQR charts out for interested parties as a safe escape route from Iran through Turkey to Western European and North American destinations. The promised lands of the IRQR website, Sweden, Belgium, and Canada, to name a few, are posited as, and I quote, places of freedom, end of quote, where Iranian queers would not have to hold their breath in the face of daily discrimination or deadly persecution the website propagates, and instead be able to breathe as gaily as possible. A well-to-do and self-employed interior designer and a graduate student of architecture at the University of Tehran, respectively, Karim and Sahan had lived together in upscale northern Tehran, and in their words, quite happily so, before they found themselves seeking refuge in the House of Satan. They had thought following the tracks of the IRQR would take them from the house of doubt to that of faith over the course of a breath. Unfortunately, that breath turned into 2 years, and their harvest into a drought in arid lands of Kayseri, famous in Turkey as a staunchly conservative city in the Anatolian heartland. Locked in Turkey on their way out of the illicit hell of queer sexualities, namely Iran, on a perpetually delayed trip to their putative heavens, Belgium, Canada, and Sweden, Karim and Sahan were confronted with a difficult chain of translation. And chain of translation is a term I'm borrowing from Michel Calon. They had to transform themselves, at least for the much-anticipated interview and the longer legal process with the UN officials in Turkey, into particular members of a social group that faced a credible fear of persecution in Iran. Only through meeting such codified expectations as Karim and Sahan would become subjects intelligible to the United Nations as homosexual refugees. Wearing tight jeans, high heels, and shiny shoes, and excessive makeup, as well as acting particularly effeminate, earlier travelers had added in their advice, proved to be indispensable performative acts that carried particular illocutionary force in their encounters with the UN officials who are charged with the task of assessing their cases. It's now rather passé to argue that the veiled Muslim woman and her intolerability within secular liberal and ostensibly Western sociopolitical contexts has served as the discursive and the material frontier on which an exhaustive critique of secular liberalism and its attending building block, the autonomous individual, has been articulated. The increasingly emblematic visibility of queer bodies, particularly those located in Muslim-majority countries, however, indexes a powerful counterattack, spatialized decisively in the West as their natural home, to reveal the intolerability of not only queer, but all sexed bodies in the hermetically sealed, authorizing discourse of Islam, and this is referring to Tal-Asad. What is most alarming in these attacks and counterattacks is the reproduction of a frontier in between, a frontier which stands for the incommensurability of Islam and secularism, if not liberal interpretation of religion at large, the toleration, protection, and valorization of queer bodies in Western and Northern geographies as the latest litmus test of a genuine commitment to the so-called democratic ideals of equality and liberty is an important phenomenon that requires careful attention in its own right, as Jesper Poir's work has clearly demonstrated. My focus here, however, will be on the transplantation and circulation of this test beyond the so-called West. I want to suggest that the circulation supported by queer activists, as well as the United Nations in the case of Iranian refugees, is not an effect, but a rather constitutive part of a double bind that subjects such as Karim and Sahan confront. A double bind that is forged through the coupling of political liberalism and queer sexuality on the one hand, and illiberal alterity and Islam on the other. I want to argue that taking this transplantation simply as a corollary of modernity or Western imperialism obscures rather than reveals the complex modalities of sexual identifications, identities, and practices in contemporary Middle East in particular, and Muslim majority landscapes in general. The referential grammar of modern sexuality through which the politics of naming these identifications, identities, and practices are structured, on the one hand, first diverts attention away from the pragmatic uses of these grammars in political action. Second, conceptualizing operations of signs as merely referential also misses out on how uses of these grammars in fact index fractured genealogies of sexual desire, practice, and identification in Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East. It's only once Amrad, Mukhannas, Kochek, and Zenne, the first two are from Persian and the latter two are from Ottoman and Turkish, are systematically displaced from the historical grammars of sexuality in the Middle East that hamjinsbaz and eschjinsel, as well as gay, lesbian, and homosexual, as well as queer, come to dominate the contemporary uses of a modern grammar of sexuality in the Middle East. My aim here is not to excavate an archaeology of these fractured genealogies, to redeem a sovereign field of gender and sexuality studies in the Middle East, vis-a-vis a temporally and spatially demarcated ars erotica. My aim is rather to introduce a third term, namely Islamic sexualities as proposed by Najmabadi and Baboyan, to upset the temporal and spatial division of scientia sexualis and ars erotica on the one hand, and rethink about the formations of the irreligious and not simply about the formations of the secular or liberal in its intimacies with sexuality and sexed bodies on the other. So formations of the irreligious is kind of a spin on Hussein Aghraman's work, which is about kind of indifference to religion when we're talking about secularism, right? So he writes about formations of the secular. So I kind of want to flip it. And I want to talk about sexuality in Muslim majority countries, but not rely on secularism and liberalism. It must be noted in passing that there are structurally similar problems all refugees face in Turkey, due to the fact that Turkey is one of the 4 countries in the world, along with Madagascar, the Congo, and the Vatican, that signed the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol on the condition of upholding a geographical limitation, which continues to define refugees as only those individuals displaced from Europe. Unlike the political refugees such as the dissident journalists, lawyers, and bloggers linked to the Green Movement, or religious minorities such as the Baha'i community, Karim and Sahan cannot premise their cases of life-threatening discrimination based on a normatively recognized collectivity, such as those defined by religious practice, political activity, linguistic and ethnic identity. Gender, sex, and sexuality have never been taken as legal categories through which a community could be discursively imagined, normatively defined, and legally protected against prosecution under the liberalizing regime of international refugee law. So it has to go through this one add-on term that is basically added on to the 1967 convention, which is a particular social group, right? It's on this historically inter-articulating axis of political liberalism and modern sexuality that I want to track the highly unpredictable and far from liberating journeys of the IRQR travelers such as Karim and Sahan. More specifically in this paper, I focus on the interviewing process between the asylum seekers who aim to substantiate their claims to the right to move to a third country, and the UN officials who test, verify, and qualify the claims of life-threatening discrimination and the danger of prosecution as a critical mode of translation with serious legal as well as political implications. I suggest it's through this negotiated interviewing process that a distinctly Iranian cartography of sexuality is mapped out by transforming Iranian nationals' testimonies of discrimination into confessions of sexuality in Iran. These legally sanctioned technologies also chart out particular conditions of possibility for the asylum seekers, such as Karim and Sahan, and international queer activists, such as Ashan Parsi, the leader of the IRQR, in distinct ways. While they are operationalized as techniques of transnational mobility by the Iranian asylum seekers, the same testimonies serve as the evidentiary basis and the mobilizing force behind a transnational network of queer activists who pursue the expansion and protection of sexual freedoms as a universally applicable political project wedded to liberal politics. Even a cursory look at the historical development of international refugee law and its continued failure to codify gender, sex, and sexuality as legal categories within its textual arsenal reveals the coupling of political liberalism and queer sexuality as an incomplete alignment born out of a recent historical conjuncture, as opposed to being a trans-historical ethical commitment or a natural organic bond. More significantly for our purposes here, an ethnographic look at the contemporary negotiations of Iranian asylum seekers provides us with important insights into how the internal gaps and contradictions of this recent and unstable alignment are bridged and concealed by constructing confessions about sexuality in Iran, and by liberating and adopting those subjects suffering under the illiberal regime of the Iranian state. So one thing that I want to highlight here is the fact that in discussions of homonationalism, we talk about how the alignment is incomplete and how this needs to be bridged within the nation. And one of the arguments that I'm trying to push forward is that it actually is happening outside of the nation. And it's actually not only about production of an alignment between liberalism and queer sexuality, but it's about production of illiberality. So the constitutive outside has to be constructed as well. And everything that is about Iran that's operationalized here is key, I think. Karim and Sahan decided to embark on their IRQR journey after a house party organized by a friend of theirs in northern Tehran was raided by the city police. Because it was the host's third violation, he was immediately arrested. These men who were present at the apartment, on the other hand, were interrogated on the spot, and their personal information and addresses were recorded as a first warning. Karim and Sahan, like all of their friends at the party, complied with the police officers' requests to disclose their personal information and left the party, hoping that the Moral Police would not follow up with them. A week later, 2 Moral Police officers showed up at their door with a search warrant. They recovered smuggled alcohol at the bar and pornographic DVDs in their bookshelves. They also searched through Karim and Sahan's computer, copying their IP address and temporary files and internet cookies. The latter 2 of which included visits to queer and gay social networking sites. Karim and Sahan were informed that this was their last warning to come to their senses and go back to the straight path of Islamic morality, given that they actually looked like respectable men and not like some other Cunys. Cuny is a word for the bottom or the passive partner in anal discourse in Persian. This call to the straight path was the last drop in the glass for Karim and Sahan, who left Iran for Turkey on a bus, heading to Damascus via Turkey, where we met when I was conducting preliminary research on a pilgrimage route. Before Karim and Sahan set out to have their first interview with the United Nations officials, they had received countless advice from friends in the house, as well as others who had been through the process, about the risks they were taking in their self-presentation as bears. If they looked too masculine, Karim and Sahan were warned, their ability to convince the officers that they faced a credible fear of prosecution in Iran would be restrained. Instead, the former travelers on the IRQR strongly recommended that they go with a rather theatrical performance, catered to the stereotypes of those individuals who transgress gender binaries as a way of enacting their sexual desires. Wear tight jeans, put some makeup on, act like a girl were some of the advice that the former travelers gave Karim and Sahan. They both responded by saying that the UN officials would understand how the parameters of deviance and possibility of prosecution for not visibly hamjinsbaz or same-sex player men were set through a different set of dynamics in Iran. They were wrong. At the end of the first interview, the officers were unconvinced not only by the credibility of fear of prosecution that Karim and Sahan might face if they had gone back to Iran, they were also unconvinced that Karim and Sahan were a same-sex couple to begin with. The United Nations officials scheduled them for another appointment with another officer in 6 months' time and asked them to use this interval to collect documents that would make a more convincing case about the credibility of their fear of prosecution. Once they got home and told their housemates about the decision, no one seemed surprised. And I quote, "It's not the time to act stubborn," put one roommate, Mariam, bluntly. As a Tehrani M2F trans woman, she had escaped her abusive husband, and without anywhere else to go, she had set out for Turkey 6 months ago. She had gotten her refugee status recognized the previous week, at the time waiting for her papers to be released so that she could move to Sweden. Karim and Sahan were asked to reproduce any documents that might verify the police raid or show any legal action taken against them. while Maryam's interview was taken at face value and she was asked to wait for her asylum status to be recognized. It was as if, because Maryam's sexuality was readily legible and was understood as a vulnerable form of existence, even in Western landscapes of illegit queer freedom, the credibility of her fear was already taken for granted. Meanwhile, because in the United Nations officials' eyes, Karim and Sahan did not look legibly homosexual, let alone particularly vulnerable ones, their narratives had to be further validated with additional documentation, which was very difficult, if not altogether impossible, to reproduce. So, in essence, if the goal is to escape one life-threatening designation of deviance, one needs to be submissive about reproducing the norms of the liberal legal framework that serves as the infrastructure, an unstable one, but still an infrastructure of an escape route out of that designation. Unlike Maryam, however, Karim and Sahan seem to be caught in a double bind. And in Iran, they're deemed excessively deviant and hence targets of interrogation and disciplinary correction, while in the United Nations office, not adequately deviant and hence unworthy of legal protection unless they can prove otherwise. In a critical mode of translation, then, the very definition of excess is reversed through collected confessions whereby the historically sedimented and culturally complex relationship between transsexuality and homosexuality in Iran gains a new meaning through a mistranslation, which nonetheless produces important political traction for certain subjects. Such mistranslations not only set the parameters of international legal protection against sexuality-based prosecution, but also sets out a general cartography of sexuality in Iran. And it's important, I guess, to mention here in passing that Iran is only second to Thailand in the world in terms of sex reassignment surgeries. And if a person doesn't have enough money, the state actually subsidizes the surgeries. Of course, this is a, Afsaneh Najmabadi is just coming up with her book that is dealing with this kind of ambiguous situation that transsexuality takes. And what does that mean? Is it a tactical of kind of purification of these roles and actually heterosexualization of transsexuality? But what I'm trying to highlight here is that actually one of the most threatening kind of figures, right? But again, stock figures are the feminine lesbians and the masculine men, right? Because those become kind of the worst kind of actors against this purification. So let me be clear about the argument that I'm trying to advance here, and I'll wrap up. The conditions of possibility that this alignment between political liberality and queer sexuality opens up for those subjects desirous of mobility cannot be reduced to that alignment alone. In other words, this is not an argument about universal concepts such as rights in general and sexual rights in particular, how they circulate and accrue particular meanings in different historical and geographical contexts. Such a formulation keeps in place an origin story of rights that by virtue of its modularity renders later adoptions derivative. What I mean to do is to upset the spatiotemporal hierarchy of origin and destination by showing how rights politics in any place, be it Stonewall, New York, or contemporary Tehran, is informed by previous histories of claim-making and techniques of the collective as well as individual action. To understand right politics in the murky and uncodified realm of international refugee law, particularly in relation to sexuality, then we need to I suggest we need to attend to both regional histories of claim-making and sexuality as well as transnational histories of the circulation. Such an alignment that couples queer sexuality and liberal legality has serious implications for not only how liberalism is constructed historically, but how a similar discursive operation binds illiberal alterity and Islam together as the cosmological episteme through which one should approach Muslim-majority landscapes and their inhabitants. Not unlike heated debates about gender equality and women's movements in the region, such an alignment leaves same-sex couplings increasingly vulnerable to charges of being products of Western liberal sensibilities, if not positing them outright as perverting and invasive pawns of Western imperialism at large. And this is the type of gay international argument which I have no tolerance for. Or empire of cheese, if you like that better. So I'll end, switching here. running out of time. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we basically decouple sexuality from liberalism and secularism to begin with, right? And think about liberal interpretations of religion and histories of sexuality, be it sexual identification or practice in the Middle East, in relation to formations of the irreligious on the one hand. So what I mean by irreligious is basically an indifference to religion. So Islam, we don't really ask Christianity to account for sexuality in the US, so why the hell are we asking for Islam to account for it in the Middle East or in Muslim majority countries? So if we approach the current conjuncture of political liberalism, queer sexuality as incomplete and differentiate the formations of the irreligious from those of the secular as a political doctrine of a particularly Western genealogy that helps conceal reconfigurations of Western imperialism, we can not only attend to the now fully fractured genealogies of Islamicate sexualities, but more significantly, through this double move, we can reflect on the long tradition of liberal interpretation of religion, not as an invention that has an elective affinity with some unitary Western or Christian genealogy, but rather as a part and parcel of the multiple threads that help constitute the heteroglossy of Islam. After all, as the renowned scholar Emrah Yildiz that I opened with, who's rather hard to designate as a secular liberal subject, reminds us, in practice, the spatial and temporal distance from the station of faith to that of disbelief is but a breath. And that breath was well allowed to pass and travel vast distances in bodily practices as well as discursive recitations in the 11th century Persianate world. That breath was not held inside until either Europe enlightened the globe or liberal humanism emerged out of a Europe tired of war and destruction, or the authorizing discourse of Islam was broken down by European imperialism. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Fatime Jaffer, and her paper is entitled Inside the Box, Homo-Nationalist Discourses in Media and Queer Organizing in Canada.
Thanks. I actually need some help. I'm wondering if you could click the slides for me.
I can conclude.
Oh, can you? Great, thanks. So I'll just kind of tell you.
I'll keep an eye.
Great. So you have to open it. It's on the desktop, and it's that, yeah. And it has the wrong title on because I changed the slideshow at the last minute. So I do have a prepared one with the correct title. So I just want to thank the organizers, as others have done, and especially for having the conference in New York. Because no one's said this before, but I love New York. And I also want to thank, I believe it's the Iroquois and the Algonquin nations, albeit I'm here on their traditional land as an uninvited guest. So my presentation today is based on an earlier one that I had done in Paris last summer at the Crossroads and Cultural Studies Conference. And Sarah Ahmed attended the panel I was on, and in the Q&A, she prefaced a question to me with very kind words, and they were, homonationalism is like a muscle. You can only stretch it so far. And I don't know if you've read her latest book, but she's all about body parts. So but it was an interesting metaphor. So I want to preface my talk with the caveat that I'm at an early stage of my academic interrogation of muscles, and in particular, Puart's Homonationalism, Scott Morganson's historical extension of the term settler homonationalism, Jin Harita Warren and Paula Bacchetti's Homonationalism 1 for state homonationalism, and Homonationalism 2 for queer organizations. And in Canada, Suzanne Lennon and Umisori Dryden have the extension of extensions, homonationalisms in the plural, to capture, which they feel it's necessary to capture geographical specificity. And I find these have been very useful in giving theoretical weight to an analysis that was already emerging and being developed on the ground, on the fly, as we were responding to unfolding events. So I want to kind of walk you through one small case study, which I locate as a historical flashpoint in the long line of imperial tactics. My longer-term aim is to trace the genealogies of such events, and by this I mean, in an unrelated example, for example, the use of passbooks as they were tactics used in South Africa and Zimbabwe and East Africa, on and off reservations in Canada during slavery, the Jim Crow eras, Nazi Germany, and so on. So my aim is to look at the biopolitics of these tactics and to trace the continuities and discontinuities of imperial tendencies over time and space. So, and a little more context before I begin is that Tricone, Vancouver, there's a Tricone in San Francisco, which is the original that I'm sure you're aware of. In Vancouver is a political and social unfunded organization of about 145 South Asian LGBTQs in the Lower Mainland, which is what Greater Vancouver is known as. And I'm the media spokesperson and facilitator of the group. And also, more recently, a PhD student, so I'm what academia likes to call the insider-outsider. And the story is set in Canada, a settler nation, or a neo-Europe on unceded Indigenous lands. So the population of Vancouver, which is Canada's third largest city, is 51% non-white, though they're still referred to as visible minorities. The majority of whom are Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians. It also has a large South Asian population, of which Punjabi Sikhs make up 76% of the South Asian population. The Muslim population of all ancestries is relatively much smaller. It also has the largest massive unceded indigenous territories, in part because the province did not, in the 1800s, did not recognize Aboriginal title and simply appropriated the land, as well as the most diverse range of nations. There are almost 200 across the province. The low-end estimate of the indigenous population in BC is less than 200,000, or less than 5% of BC's population. So, I'll try to get to it. My activist and scholarly work focuses on the figure of the racialized queer Canadian, as it appears and disappears in national, political, and media discourses. So media stories build on tropes and themes familiar to readers. The tropes reflect a cultural archive and thus act as a shorthand or common sense of what we as readers and viewers are assumed to believe or likely to accept. So I argue, and here I quote critical race feminist scholar Sunera Tabani, underneath the sanitized garb of a postmodern, multiracial, multi-ethnic, tolerant Canada beats the heart of a stubbornly colonial national formation, sharing a common imaginary with other white settler nations and societies. So as such, media tropes, I argue, have not substantively changed since Confederation, and that was the official inception of Canada as a nation state, although they have varied tactically over time and space. So, next slide. Thanks. You can see.
Yeah.
On Turtle Island, as historically in colonized lands across the world, the tropes of white superiority versus the racial inferiority of the other, and the other as savage and resistant and backward, resistant to progress, have traditionally been applied to Indigenous peoples and in Canada, and are extended to racialized citizens, immigrants, and newcomers in a triangulated fashion. Where the national remains at the center, the immigrant receives a tenuous and conditional inclusion, and the Aboriginal continues to be marked for loss of sovereignty. After the entry of official multiculturalism onto the Canadian stage in the 1970s, overtly racist media tropes gave way to culturalism as the overarching discursive frame. So that is a cultural language of diversity, which obscures, displaces, and erases the realities of racism. as Jivani, Thabani, Himani Banerjee, among others, have explored. So the next slide. On this slide, for example, the framing is of the perpetrator's race in news stories where the gay basher is not white, which utilizes the trope of cultural backwardness attached to the perpetrator's race, which is the frame. So conversely, the racial background of the perpetrator is not the frame, and cultural backwardness is not the trope in stories where the gay basher is a white Christian man, nor were they the tropes when Canada's Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, opposed same-sex marriage in 2007 and 2008, and again in 2010, sparking openly homophobic discourses in the mainstream media. So the textual universe, as Syed calls it, a worlding of the world, let's be back, constituted by the frequency, prevalence, or repetitive use of a trope is what gives tropes the muscle to commit the epistemic violence on the racialized figure. This textual universe in the Canadian context takes form in what we call Canadian values. So the invocation of certain values as inherently and naturally possessed by the white Canadian national, whose teleological appeal I will demonstrate. So in the story, on December 15, 2007, Vancouver's prominent daily newspaper, the Vancouver Sun's cover story was entitled, "Canada's Changing Moral Landscape, Are Immigrants to the Country Changing the Face of What is Considered Right or Wrong?" And the first paragraph reads, "I hate homosexuality," says Balwan Singh Gill, a prominent leader, and I'm assuming you can read it, so I won't read it. That article was published 5 days after December 10th, 2007. There was an action by 2,000 protesters, most of them Punjabi Sikh, to block the Canadian government's deportation of Laibar Singh, a paralyzed refugee claimant from India. So coinciding with International Human Rights Day, the protesters had gathered at Vancouver's International Airport and stopped his deportation by Canadian Border Services, which led mainstream media to lambaste them for their illegal and violent behavior. The connection between these events formed the crux of my story of a homonationalism, as it manifests in Vancouver, a city lauded in Canadian travel guides for its tolerance and diversity. And it's particularly for its conceptualization of what she calls the new post-9/11 era of white gay male politics, to which I'm drawn. That is that homonationalist discourses construct immigrant populations and immigrants of color as more homophobic than Canadians, which serves to propel and heighten anti-immigrant and Islamophobic sentiments, and ultimately to bolster, in Paul's case, she's talking about U.S. sexual exceptionalism. I also draw on Scott Morganson's 2011 essay, Settler Homonationalism, where he extends that historical frame by tracing the roots of homonationalism to the sexual violence and terror of the colonization of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, where Porras sees a terrorist Muslim as the queer population marked for death. Morganson says it's always already Native people who have been the queer population marked for death. Queer movements for rights, as such, have become less queer because, okay, I'm going to skip this part because I assume you're familiar with the literature. But I also draw on Shireen Razak for her analysis of the rhetoric of rights, which in law is premised on the idea that each person is free to pursue his or her own interests. And this feeds the illusion that the subordinate groups are not oppressed, merely different and less developed. Therefore, reducing the source of othering differences to the merely cultural enables the framing of violence to be the result of certain indigenous traditions, rather than of the power relations of heterosexism or patriarchy. And for the most part, these scholars, and I've been using a lot of critical race scholars as opposed to queer scholars, have been concerned with how the other racialized immigrant gets constructed as culturally and irremediably patriarchal, I follow their logic to argue that culturalism propels the framing of South Asians, Muslims, and other racialized people as inherently culturally homophobic. And the homophobia we face as queers of color gets constructed as a consequence of the failure of racialized queer and straight communities to assimilate or adapt to Western white norms. That is, to adopt values of tolerance, diversity, and civility, which we call Canadian values. I have to race. Okay. So I'm going to skip this. So Balwant Singh Gill's comment in The Sun, "I hate homosexuality," inevitably provoked an outcry among Vancouver's queers. As the facilitator of Tricone Vancouver, I expected media calls for our reaction, but only two came, one from Punjabi TV News, and the other was from Vancouver's queer newspaper Extra West. The mainstream media overwhelmingly carried the voices of the queer community leaders, and I use queer community in quotes, who decried the South Asian community as culpable for all the homophobia in Vancouver. The fact that Balwant Singh Gill was the only South Asian quoted in the story on immigrant values shows how media frames communities of color as homogeneous and monolithic. The Sun blithely put it, Gill, the spokesperson for 39 Sikh temples in British Columbia, appears to combine in one person many of the conservative, I'm quoting, and libertarian values that immigrants are bringing to and expressing in Canada. Incidentally, the values referenced in the story had been defined as such by an Angus Reid poll that found immigrants hold different values. For example, only 17% of immigrants versus 19% of real Canadians hold middle-of-the-road views. What these values are is not clear, these views. The reporter does note that immigrants also appear, and this is a quote, immigrants also appear to be more morally polarized than native-born Canadians. But this statement is lost in the overall framing of the story, which spilled over from the front page onto two broadsheet center spread pages to answer ultimately in the affirmative the question, are immigrants the main reason British Columbians are losing their reputation as morally easygoing and freedom-loving? It's noteworthy that the only other immigrant quoted in the story was an engineer who came to Canada from Hong Kong. A random engineer who came to Canada from Hong Kong. Bill Chu likewise represented the voice of the entire Chinese community, who are 41% of Vancouver's population. Nowhere in the story do we learn that Gill was wrong, that Sikh texts do not allude to homosexuality at all, nor was there any effort made to interview South Asian queers. And here we appear as disappeared, or what Fatime Jaffer calls an oxymoron. What's also noteworthy is the conflation of religious beings and racial beings, that is, Sikhism standing in for all South Asian. And we see that too with Islam and Muslims, which led Shireen Razak to theorize Muslim as is now post 9/11 a racial, not a religious category. But most importantly, Gill claimed that his comment, "I hate homosexuality," had been made in an interview with the Vancouver Sun 3 years before, though this was publicly disputed by the reporter. So the next, I think I'm actually skipping. So this was the LIBOR thing. And this is a connection. This appeared 5 days later. So by pitting white queers against South Asians, the media constructed these two communities as separate and monolithic, failing to take into account not only intersections, but that you could be both queer and immigrants or South Asian, but also the alliances that exist among and between the two communities. South Asian queers, such as members of Tricone Vancouver, were placed in a double bind, recognizing the racism of the Vancouver Sun story and the homophobia trap it had set. And it was difficult to ignore how the move by the media to publish this story at this particular time worked in the interest of a state openly angered at the failed deportation of Laibar Singh, coverage of which had been front-page news all that week. So in the interview with Extra West, I condemned the homophobic comment by Gill and the racist tone of the Vancouver Sun's article. And I'm going to skip a bit here. The Extra West ran a story. I'm hoping that's the next slide. Yes. And their subtitle, basically it was about controversies highlight divisions in the queer community, and they identified those divisions as those that say homophobia is the primary issue, and others more focused on what they considered the racist response to Gill's comments. So the irony of the frame is that the thrust of my comments had been to point out the problematic of the binary construction of queer versus people of color. And in the story itself, I make it clear that racism by the Vancouver Sun and white queers was the divisive issue, not Gill's homophobia, which affects us all as queers. Okay, just maybe go to the next slide, and I'm not going to go into that. So, I mean, what's clear in the kind of comments that we had is that the homophobic intolerance in the South Asian community is part of our cultural construct, rather than a system of dominance and power manifesting across cultures. And I'll just try and summarize. There was a meeting held a few days later, December 21st, by Vancouver's queer public sector, at which I was berated, kind of held up and berated for trivializing Gill's comments and condoning homophobia. The perception that I'd chosen race over queer, that I'd not been queer in a way acceptable to the dominant white queer community, was framed as me not having stood up for Canadian values. So I posit that such accusations emerge from either or assumptions that pit queer against race as distinct rather than interlocking identities. I'm trying to skim through a fair bit. So I'll just the message of the media frame was simple. The Homo subject is under threat by immigrant others. The message from the queer community was also simple. Queers of all races can belong and can accumulate national and social capital as queers of color if we conform to a queer identity and a queer liberation that centralizes whiteness as national identity. So our emancipation is thus linked to a queer Canadianness, which requires us to join a project of modern sexuality. And the cornerstone demand is that we break away from our traditional communities and adopt individuated identities as queers. Only then can we find our place, but again, conditionally in what Thabani calls the master narrative of the nation. But critical to resisting this rescue narrative is an awareness that we become implicated in homonationalism individually. So where Paula Baketty and Jin Haritwon distinguish homonationalism 1 for state institutions, homonationalism 2 for queer organizations, I'm drawing on critical race work, writers Thabani, Razak, Banerjee, who theorize we are individually, socially, hierarchically structured in Canadian society. So the invitation to accumulate whiteness and national capital, which includes the invitation to what Morgenstern calls the colonial biopolitics of sexual modernity, is made to us individually, which calls not only for systemic change, but recognition of individual culpability, complicity, and responsibility for white settler hegemony. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all four panelists for very, very rich papers, and we have about 30 minutes or so for discussion. And maybe just to get us going, I just want to sort of say a few words around continuities and commonalities between the papers that I thought was really interesting. So Katherin started us out with the question, what does it mean to gain refugee status or apply for refugee status in a state of ongoing settler colonialism? And I think that question really sort of runs throughout all four papers. So the question of what kinds of violences do these rescue narratives cover over, I think is something that all four of you really were grappling with. Second, the whole question of disclosure, the confessional, what Emrah calls the chain of translation that is enjoined on those seeking asylum, I think becomes really clear. So the performance of a kind of intelligible queerness, as Emrah's paper stated, and the ways in which one's deviance has to be rendered adequate and comprehensible, right? So that's another sort of continuity I saw between the papers. Third, I think what all the papers do in important ways is articulate a need to move beyond, and I think this is what Colleen was saying, the need to move beyond a mere critique of Western imperialism, a mere critique of pinkwashing, right? Or a kind of reframing of what you said, Emrah, of the liberal versus the secular. And so instead, what I saw all four papers doing in interesting ways was, in fact, articulate sort of alternative modes of analysis, but also alternative modes of representation, and even sort of framing the argument itself, right? So Colleen, I was fascinated by that move at the end of your paper where you showed that work that juxtaposed the checkpoint, right? The performance at the checkpoint with this kind of catwalk performance, right? And I'd love you to perhaps say a little bit more about questions of the gaze and spectatorship in both those instances. So that's this kind of alternative mode of representation that you were suggesting. Emrah, I really appreciate your framing of irreligious sexualities that moves beyond the kind of dialectic of secular and liberalism. And finally, Fatima, I think an organization like Tricon, as you mentioned, really is producing a kind of alternative narrative, right? That pushes, as you said, against the queer here versus the race there. So anyway, so those are some sort of framing comments, and with that, I'd love to open up the floor for a discussion. Thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah.
Question. Colleen, is Invisible Man really a documentary?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it depends on how you would. It's being marketed, promoted, and screened as a documentary, so it's being screened at documentary film festivals. I think there's certainly an argument there for aspects of it that aren't, nonfiction, that aren't documentary. But to the extent that you could kind of do that with any and all documentary, I think it gets a little bit tricky there, but I think it is important that it's definitely traveling around as a documentary at human rights festivals, at documentary festivals.
I'm actually just piggybacking off what you're saying, that it's really a documentary of Yarid's journey as an Israeli person discovering queer Palestinians. So if there's truth, I think that is a truth that comes through in the documentary. He also chose the main character as someone who has no Arab friends, who has a very strong attachment to Tel Aviv, who really loves Israeli culture. And so to me, watching the documentary, I saw that as a sort of a conscious choice on his part.
Or even constructed.
Yeah.
You don't really know.
I don't know him. I don't know anything about the person in the documentary, but that's what comes through, right? And then this is just a comment that when I saw this at the Jewish Film Festival in San Francisco, Gary said that the HRC is screening it for the US State Department as a documentary. So just a little piece of information.
When is that happening?
It had happened the same week that I saw the documentary, which was about 2 weeks ago. So I haven't heard anything about that aside from.
Could you say it again? We couldn't hear what you
I'm
said.
sorry, but I was at a screening of Invisible Men in San Francisco, and Yariv was there doing a question and answer. And Yariv is the filmmaker. And he said that the HRC is screening the film Invisible Men for the US State Department. I'm assuming for some nefarious purpose.
Yeah, so clearly there we can, it'll be read as
Yeah.
a documentary. It's just sort
Yes.
of exposing.
Just other ways that it's circulating as truth.
I have another question about the same film. Could you talk a little bit more about what you thought of his refusal to bring one of the men he kind of interviewed without entire consent back to Tel Aviv with him because the law prevents him from doing so? And
You mean for why he can't seek asylum status in Israel?
no,
I'm
one
sorry,
of the
I didn't-
characters that he filmed in Ramallah, or one of the men that he filmed in Ramallah, he had called in an emergency. He was had been kicked out of his home, and called his friend who was with Yariv. So Yariv came with his friend and kind of filmed him on the spot in this cafe in Ramallah, and then picked up and left, and the guy sort of walks out into the street.
Can't remember.
Sorry,
Kind of think about the
specific
particular
question.
moment. Did you have a comment about that moment or something that would put that?
Well, I mean, it's sort of interesting that he's accepting the structure of apartheid as sort of the structure of his film as well, and sort of he doesn't want to violate the law of bringing this guy in his car into Tel Aviv because that would be violating Israeli
Yeah,
sort of.
absolutely.
And that's sort of he talks about in some of his interviews in the media, and even the Israeli media is kind of shocked at him not taking this guy in his car when he's basically homeless.
Right, that's like that kind of that piercing, that thin critique kind of thing where people think it's like a progressive film in some ways, and then they ask a couple more questions of him, and they find and when they say, well, do you challenge that for instance Israel doesn't offer the asylum to these men, and he says, well, no, there's good reasons why not to just kind of allow that. So this kind of specter of the terrorists, for instance, yeah.
Thanks for those very interesting presentations. I've got a short question and a long question. The short question is for Emrah, and it's just what happened to the two men you were interviewing, and the long question arises out of that. And very quickly, there's some fascinating documentation coming out of the Refugee Law Project at Makerere University in Uganda, which identified that a whole lot of refugees coming from the Great Lakes region, the war-torn Great Lakes region, were refugees because of violence committed against them because they were gender non-conforming. But these people had no identity as LGBT whatsoever. If they had any identity, their identity was as sex workers. But through their engagement with the Refugee Law Project, and through the way the Refugee Law Project helped them to see that because they were gender non-conforming, they would have access to refugee status, they shifted their own identities from being sex workers to being LGBT, and have formed a very powerful affinity group called the Angels. Yeah. And so the question I have for all the panelists dealing with, well, I suppose for you dealing with refugees, is what happens to the subjectivity, or how does one begin to think about, and also theorize what happens to the subjectivity of a refugee as he or she crosses these boundaries from one kind of epistemological territory into another.
Folks want to respond to that?
Sure. So it's my way of getting at least one question out of the listeners, so I don't disclose the information. They were able to move to Canada after 2 years. And I kind of had to rush through some of the story, but I kind of mentioned in passing that Turkey is one of the worst places you can get stuck in as a refugee because of the soil tax that they charge you, and because, having signed the Refugee Convention that changes the definition of a refugee only on the condition that, we define refugees still as ones displaced from Europe. That makes things convenient for them because it's such a huge kind of transit route that they sit on. In terms of what happens to the subjectivities, I think that was kind of the line that I was trying to walk, and it's a very thin line. So what I was trying to suggest to a certain extent was there was a double move, right? In that when you cite a discourse, I don't think that you become, by definition, referentially locked to that discourse. You can pragmatically use it for a different type of purpose. So in that sense, I don't necessarily see two fundamentally kind of divided or opposed epistemes of sexuality, sexual desire, sexual practice. In that that also becomes the premise on which then you can kind of claim that this is the modern one and this is the, culturally different one, right? So it becomes that kind of a problematic. So in order to kind of avoid that kind of reproduction, let's say, of certain dilemmas. So in that sense, what is ars erotica, right? We keep talking about intimacies, desires, and identifications, practices, when we try to talk about the non-sciences sexualis, right, since Foucault. And it becomes very difficult, and these people become susceptible if they use it tactically. So to me, Kedem and Sahand wanted to leave because they had an opportunity to do so, right? Not fundamentally different from a heterosexual couple in their 20s, 30s, well-educated, kind of sick of, an oppressive regime for the type of life that they envision. And there was this, kind of unstable infrastructure that they can kind of hop on, but that didn't make them gay in the Western sense, right? If there is such a thing, right? They were gay to begin with. They were bears. I mean, So does that kind of answer your question? So I don't necessarily think that it's about, I think it's about production of those alignments more than about production of subjects per se. They become kind of inscribed bodies, right? Which then creates two bizarre conversations that don't really talk to each other. One is this liberal secular sexuality stuff, and then the other one is the gay international type of argument where, it had no history. This is all about modernity and imperialism, traveling, and, making things gay on the ground.
And I think just to piggyback onto your comment, I think it also speaks, for me, doing forced migration studies, is the fact that so much of our looking at refugee narratives or the processes, we really focus on the process. We don't focus about what happens after you get your refugee status and you get to this country. And I think, Fatima's work particularly will be an amazing cross intersection of how individuals who maybe strategically used whatever sort of narrative they wanted to use or had labels put onto them, sexual subjectivities, and then they come to Canada, they come to another country, and how do they then negotiate that? And I think, Fatima's thing about individual agency and the choices that we make is particularly important.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for such interesting presentation. My question or my comment is just sort of to everyone on the panel, I guess in particular to Emrah, because I'm thinking about a documentary I saw a few years back about gay men or / transsexuals in Iran. That was, I guess, became quite controversial. I didn't find much about it, called Like Others. And I knew something about this. I don't want to go too far off track because maybe everyone hasn't seen this, but basically the gist of the film is that gay men are kind of being coerced into having sex changes so they can conform with that, heteronormative dynamic. Now, seeing something like that, I think for a Western person to see who's even liberal or progressive or who's trying to think globally in a more progressive way, it's hard. It was something I was able to wrap my brain around, but I find it as someone who's interested in media, who's interested in getting people to change the way they see the world outside of the American scope, it's hard to kind of translate that for people. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for something like that that is so so powerful, such strong imagery, because we've been talking about these couplings of like ways of thinking, like seeing the foreigner or the South Asian as homophobic. You see something like this where it's going, this is happening. I'm not articulating, right? But it's difficult to present it as equitably as you would like to. So I'm wondering if anyone had any ideas about how to get something like that.
Any ideas in terms of presenting?
Well, seeing something like that going on in Iran and not preventing people from seeing it so negatively. I mean, it is a negative, it's a hugely negative thing.
No, I mean,
here in the West,
there has been.
Yeah, we see transsexuality being so much more open-minded about it now, and yet we see it there sort of being used, I would say, in a negative way.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, it depends, right? What kind of subjects you're talking about. And there's a really interesting story behind, a history behind transsexuality in Iran that I'm not really well qualified to talk about. It's actually my advisor, Afsane, who is coming out with the book called Sex and Change, where I think one of the things that she suggests, and this is definitely my reading, so don't quote me on this, is that the idea of a translation, right? If we were to take this as a translation, right, between kind of very vaguely heteronormalization and kind of sex reassignment, that opens up a space for people actually not to identify, stay non-aligned to a certain extent, which could be read as purification, because there's also, this is important to note probably, one of the first fatwas that Khomeini releases once he gets back to Iran from Iraq is about transgender individuals, homosexuality, and sex assignment surgeries. He says if there is there's basically a contradiction between how you feel inside in terms of your gender, right, and your body, that should be fixed, right? But this doesn't mean that this is, again, all about purification, right? Again, I think it creates a certain infrastructure for people to tactically use this. And to be honest with you, until 2005, when people started bombarding, I mean, okay, Khatami was bombarded in 2001 as well, about, so what do you guys do to gays in Iran, right? There is no other country in the world, really, that gets targeted like this, about gays, homosexuality, homosexual rights. So there's something about this, right? Something that's quite fishy, that one needs to kind of put on the table. So why is it that when Ahmadinejad comes to Colombia, one student is like, why are you killing homosexuals? Which is actually, again, and Scott Long wrote about this, I don't know if he's here or he's around, but the whole, pogrom of, hanging gays was actually based on a misrecognition. That they were charged on rape grounds, right? They were juveniles. It would have been a much more influential international campaign for kind of protesting Iran that they were exercising capital punishment on juveniles, right? But the way the stories got picked up was about how gays were being basically prosecuted in Iran, right? And the fact that, when Ahmadinejad comes here, it's the second question, right, after the nuclear issue. And this is actually making things a lot worse on the ground for people because, it creates anxiety around sex, sexuality, sexual practices. So it's within that vein, I would kind of put this purification kind of idea, right, and how transsexuality, but it's not reducible to that. It's definitely part of the story. And there's a kind of a legal and to a certain extent theological background to it, an infrastructure that's created in Iran. But it also opens up spaces, again, as tactical moves.
Yes.
Accepting the truth of what each of the four of you are saying, somewhat sort of emerges that you're saying there shouldn't be refugee assistance, and these problems that you all identify, and it's assuming the truth, and I think you're all onto something accurate about the way you describe the refugee system and the difficulty of squeezing people's lives into a corral that was not meant for their lives. I don't hear any better solutions coming from you all, and it's almost as though, well, maybe we should just let these people stay in the countries they're in. And I have two problems with that. One is that for whatever reasons, there are a lot of people, not just in the countries you mentioned, but in many other countries of the world, who do want to leave. And as you said, they are using these systems pragmatically to their advantage. I guess I'd like to hear both. Are you suggesting that people should actually stay in the countries they're in? And then alternatively, is there a more enlightened way to serve this community that doesn't have the problems that you all describe?
First, for me, no. I'm not suggesting that at all, about that people should stay where they are or something like that. I think critiquing a system is vital to try to create alliances between individuals, because there's amazing queer activist groups within these countries that people are leaving to come to. So I think for that sense, that's not the argument I'm making. I think, but what's important, I think, is that we need to look at who has the, for me, working with refugees is about looking at, first of all, looking at the structures that define refugees and also the systems that allow some people to migrate and other people to not. Like, it's not that just any person who wants to leave can leave. There's also other factors, not only their sexual and gender identity or orientation, but their class and all these other factors.
Of course, yeah.
So for me, I think, a huge sort of part about the refugee, in looking at the refugee process and being an activist and trying to assist refugees in helping them with their claims or anything like that, is to look at the intersections of this that allow some people to be able to leave, some people not to leave, and some people who decide to stay or not to stay. So for me, my critiques, and what I said in the beginning also is that, that I think that there should be avenues for individuals, if they want to leave their country, to leave their country. But I think that there's a lot of power that decides, and a lot of, historical, ongoing, different intersections of power that decide who can leave and who can, and also the framework that individuals have to navigate through. So for me, that's just a blanket statement I want to make on that.
Well, my work is not on the kind of refugee processes, and so I can't really speak to that so much. But looking at the film Invisible Men, I would look at kind of what is the story, what is the narrative that film is telling, and it's about it's about Israeli society, and it's about Israeli activists kind of, again, we're talking about these rescue narratives, like rescuing these Palestinians from what we get from the film as a kind of oppressive patriarchal society. We don't get a lot about their society. So one thing that we don't hear about is the fact that you're saying that there are these queer Palestinian organizations, for instance, CLAGS for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society, that I do grant writing for. So the film doesn't even acknowledge that is kind of something that exists within within that society. Kind of. Yeah, that's what I said. Do you want to say something?
Well, I don't know. There's a split between what happens on the ground and what we talk about in academia, but also in terms of like the ways that we critique, even as NGO organizations, and we're in a double bind always, because there's a reality of on the ground and people needing to get in. And one of the things we use in those refugee determination processes is the rescue narrative. I mean, we play up Canada the savior, rah-rah, it's great for queers in Canada or in the United States, where we know it's not. I mean, we're the hate crime capital. Vancouver's the hate crime capital of Canada. We've got like suicides and all kinds of problems, but also once they come into the country as queer of color refugees, I mean, the situation is untenable. I mean, we've just had a couple of suicides of people who did get positive refugee determination hearings in Vancouver. But I think the critique for me is more that there's a kind of hypocrisy globally in the world, and just making the connections, the transnational kind of connections with why it becomes so impossible to live in certain countries. What's happening in Uganda, for example, the importation of the Christian fundamentalism, and Kenya was one of the places that gender reassignment surgery was pioneered, it was tested on us in the 1970s as a cure for homosexuality. And so, part of that made it impossible to be queer, where Mombasa, where I'm born, is the queer capital of Africa. I mean, it's so queer, and yet because of this whole kind of imposition, we've inherited homophobia, and we're living with it. So the reason we're leaving the country is created by the very people that then are our saviors, So I think it's important to make those connections and to keep kind of critiquing them.
Maybe one last question. Yes. Next to Desiree, yes. You have a t-shirt? No, guy with the ponytail.
So this was a question directed at Emrah. I'm sorry they've all been stacked on you.
That's all
one after another.
That's wonderful.
I'm wondering about the statement you've made, right? In terms of people not being referentially locked into a discourse once it's been introduced, but being able to tactically and pragmatically access it. And I think that's certainly an important insight to keep in mind when we're looking to not tread on people's agency, but at the same time, my presentation tomorrow is on Uganda. And one of the things that I found interesting, I was watching a back and forth debate between a queer activist called, last name I think is Navagasera, and David Bahati. And she was responding to him using the charge that he levels against queer activists and queers in general, that they recruit people into homosexuality. And, whilst it's certainly valuable to have this criticism of people like Joseph Massad, who make this very, very high-handed reference to, what identities look like. But I found it very interesting in response to what you were saying, that she was specifically using his formulation. I don't recruit people into homosexuality. No one recruited me. And I'm wondering, is that, are you saying this is an absolute thing, or are these two realities that exist? On the one hand, yes, you can tactically use these infrastructures. But on the other hand, isn't it also true that people get, trapped in this kind of discourse as well?
So there is some sort of entrapment, let's say, right? But one of the things that I was trying to suggest was, although it seems like it's in a human rights discourse, I want to kind of reframe this about claim making, first of all, if people choose to make claims, right? And then I want to look at the type of grammars on the ground that are available to these people. So that's why I kind of gave you a list of all the terms from kind of historical studies, right? From both kind of Ottoman and Qajar contexts in Iran and Ottoman Empire. The terms that were systematically erased from the languages, right? So it's easier, and this is not to say, Mukhannas, for example, was kind of that subject of the Sufi poetry that, everybody loves to write about, right? Who decides to stay who decides to stay as an object of desire, although he gets older, right? It's not a term that marks an identitarian understanding of homosexuality, but it marks something, right? And it marks something critical in terms of how, because the argument apparently Masad is developing now is about how kind of construction of liberalism was fundamental to understandings of Islam, right? And that sexuality itself, not homosexuality, but the idea of sexuality itself is a Western construct. I find that we can make similar arguments about pretty much anything. You know, iPod is a Western construct.
Sorry?
An iPod is a Western construct. But what does that do on the ground during the Iranian revolution in Egypt? I'm sorry, that's not a Western construct. That's social action, right? With some sort of history on the ground. And I want to look at how those two things kind of encounter each other. So that's one of the reasons why I was trying to suggest it's not an argument about, oh, gay means different things on the ground. Gay means different things on the ground, not just because they're spatially different. It's also, historically speaking, there is something on the ground that has been systematically destroyed, right? And those two things have to come together in our analyses before we kind of very easily say, oh, the modularity of modern sexuality, you know, created homosexuals on the ground in Egypt, and that's bad, you know? But that modern sexuality, because there's nothing else, will be used. I mean, because there's no other term for people to hold on to, right? Be it about practice, be it about intimacy, be it about identity. So that tactical use, for me, and to get back to your question, I think I'm not calling for dismantling it. I was actually trying to say that it's actually not complete. You know, it creates all these problems for people because they're case by case. You know, sex and gender are still not codified in the law, right? I mean, there are cases of, you know, people applying based on gender and sexuality-based prosecution, but it's not like religious identity, for example. It's not like ethnic group. It's not like linguistic group, right? So it shows to a certain extent that it is incomplete. If you were to ask me for a prescription, I would love to see it codified if people want to go down that road, right? I would love to see it. And other people using it pragmatically. But I don't think that means, you know, referentially speaking, they become gay or homosexual, right?
I'm sorry we're out of time, but I know other people have questions, so hopefully you can discuss informally. Thank you so much.